and welcome to our series, Science and Society, Making Sense of the World Around Us. This is our second to last one this spring. Next month will be our last Science and Society lecture, and that will be on another book, Sleep and Human Evolution. It will be Tuesday, May 12th at 5 p.m. I will send you the link and post it in the chat for that. This lecture series is co-organized and moderated by Fred Dilla, Executive Director Emeritus of the American Institute of Physics and author of Scientific Journeys, Linda Dilla, former Public Information Officer at the Jefferson Laboratory in the U.S. Department of Energy, and Colin Norman, the former news editor at Science. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Colin. So Colin, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you the wonderful Lewis Public Library that has been hosting these for the past 5 or 6 years. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for spending time on this almost spring-like day. I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Knoll. He's the Fisher Research Professor of Natural History and Planetary Sciences Emeritus at Harvard University. And as Rebecca said, he'll be talking about his brand new book, Earth and Life, which is hot off the presses. The book is a distillation of research over 50 plus years on the evolution of life and the evolution of Earth itself and the intricate interplay between the two. It's an interplay that Dr. Knoll calls a 4 billion year conversation. He somehow managed to condense 4 billion years and decades of research into 250 very, very readable pages. And now we're asking him to tell us about it in 45 minutes. Please put your questions in the chat, as Rebecca said, and I'll do my best to relay them to Dr. Knoll at the end. So, Dr. Knoll, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Now we're going to see that I am really terrible at technology, and I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, I think we're okay. Can you all see that screen clearly?
Yep,
Yes,
looks good.
It looks good.
Oh, okay. The story that I'm going to tell is a very specific one about the relationship between Earth and life. But I wanted to start out with just a few slides to give you a sense of the broader issues that I actually engage with in this new book. And maybe one of the best ways to do that is to start out with a very brief origin story. I grew up in the rural Pennsylvania Dutch country of not far from here, and it's fair to say that when I was 18, I hadn't the slightest idea what I wanted to do in life. I only really knew of a handful of professions. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer, and I was good at math, so I went to engineering school. And then, being really prescient after my first year in college, I knew that engineering and I weren't cut out for a long relationship either. And so my second year in school, it just almost out of desperation, I just took a whole bunch of science courses and math courses, and it turned out that 2 of those courses really struck a chord. I took a course on geology, which introduced me to the concept not only that Earth has a history, but that we can actually read that history, which is encrypted into the rocks that we see around us every day, and also a course on biology. And again, the idea that we can reconstruct important events in evolution, both from the comparative biology of living organisms and from fossils, those both really got me excited. And then the great moment, probably the only real insight I've ever had in my career, happened in my dorm room one evening when it struck me that maybe these 2 subjects weren't the separate universes that they seemed to be from the way they were taught. Maybe if I really wanted to understand the history of life, I could do that better if I understood Earth's physical history and the vice versa as well. And so that's really what 50 years later has led me to this, in some ways, sort of culminating book of the work I've done. As Colin said, the idea here is that pretty much everything that you experience around you, from the composition of the atmosphere to the shape of river channels, really involves the intertwined relationships between physical and biological processes. And I can just illustrate that very briefly with one slide and give a little credit. I'm not the first person to think this way. In 1799, Alexander von Humboldt actually wrote that everything is interrelated. He appreciated from his exploration of the Andes that there was no sense in trying to understand the biota without understanding the physical setting in which it resided. And so he was way ahead of his time. He did, by the way, already in the early 1800s, envision a time when humans might actually play a very active role in these processes. So he was a remarkable person. Now, let's just think about our own bodies, that if you look at the composition of your cells, 40% of the dry weight is carbon. Now, where does that carbon come from? Well, of course, you get it from the food that you eat. And if you are eating salmon, the salmon gets its carbon from food that it ate back to what are called primary producers, that is, plants and plankton in the oceans and lakes, in which take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or dissolved in seawater and actually reduce it to sugar, to organic molecules from which we can build our own bodies and derive energy. Now, if you look at that slide, it suggests that the amount of carbon that's taken out of the atmosphere every year by photosynthetic organisms is a pretty healthy percentage of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if there's nothing else going on, the experiment of life only lasts a few years, and we just run out of CO2. Now, all of you know that you've lived a long life, and we have not run out of CO2. And the reason for that is that cycling the carbon that has been taken into organisms by photosynthesis, either directly or indirectly, we respire. Everybody who's listening to this Zoom, while you're doing it, you are taking in oxygen, using that to oxidize organic matter, and you give off carbon dioxide in the process. So there is a cycle there that rapidly cycles carbon between the physical Earth and the biological Earth and back again. Now, it turns out that respiration almost equals photosynthesis, but not quite. About 1% of the organic matter that gets fixed into biological carbon will get buried in sediments and not be respired. Now, again, there's a net then pulling of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So again, that tells us something else must be going on. Another important process is the chemical weathering of rocks that are exposed to the atmosphere. Again, carbon dioxide can react with water to form a weak acid, and that etches the rocks that are outcropping on mountainsides, and the carbon from that ends up in the oceans as limestone. So that doesn't make things better, it makes it worse. So there must be something that sort of balances all of these processes, and that balance comes from volcanoes that generate CO2. Much of that CO2 was once at the Earth's surface and was pulled down into Earth's mantle by a process called plate tectonics. But the important point, I don't want to emphasize this too much, but the important point is that the balance that we experience in things like the availability of CO2 and the carbon that goes into our bodies and out of it again really requires both short-term biological processes and longer-term geological processes. Now, I could have told a very similar story on nitrogen, which For every 100 atoms of carbon in your cells, there's about 16 of nitrogen. And again, there are both short-term biological processes. The heroes in this particular game are bacteria, but there are also longer-term geological processes that essentially keep the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere about the same. I could tell the same story for phosphorus, and we'll talk a little bit more about phosphorus later on. The point is that Earth and life are inextricably intertwined. Now, I'm going to tell the story of oxygen just because it's something that, on the one hand, we probably rarely think about, and on the other hand, we couldn't do without. And I'll start out with two factual statements. And the first is that life on Earth could not have begun on an oxygen-rich planet. Many years ago, I was on the science team for NASA's MER mission to Mars, the first rover mission that allowed people like me to actually do geology on another planet. And it became very clear that the surface of Mars was actually quite oxidizing. There's not a lot of oxygen, but there's some. And so one evening, I wrote to all my friends who do research on origins of life, and I said, what happens if you add oxygen to your experiments? And they said, oh, don't be silly. We wouldn't do that because the experiments just don't work. And that's right. When life began, Earth had to have been an oxygen-poor planet. The second statement is that you and me, and really many other species, could not exist on an oxygen-poor Earth. So if Earth had no oxygen when it began, and you need oxygen for us to live, then the conclusion must be that Earth went through major environmental transition through its long history. Okay? So now that raises a question. We would like to know how much oxygen was at the Earth's surface at different points in our planet's history. Now, the planet is about 4.5 billion years old. We have rocks for the last 4 billion years at least. And the oldest samples of air that we can actually capture and analyze are little bubbles of air that gets trapped in glacial ice as it forms. And the oldest examples of that, found only recently, are about 6 million years old. So if we want to understand the long-term history of oxygen in the environment, we have to have some proxies. And there's a number of good ones. I'll just point out one right now and point out a place that helps us to really calibrate these things. You're looking at a picture of the Black Sea. As some of you will know, the Black Sea is interesting in that the upper 100 meters or so is oxygen rich because it's in contact with the atmosphere. But the deeper part of the Black Sea basin is anoxic. There's no oxygen there. And so we can look at various kinds of chemical signatures and see how what we find in sediments that are accumulating beneath shallow oxygenated water and those that are accumulating between deeper oxygen poor water, and see if that tells us anything. And one thing that has told us a lot is iron. Turns out that there's a lot of iron in sediments as they accumulate. Much of it simply comes from the weathering of iron-bearing minerals in things like granite and that. But when you're in an environment that doesn't have much oxygen, there are other reactions between iron that can now be in solution and with oxygen or with carbonate or with sulfur minerals, and you get something called highly reactive iron. Okay, so if you then look at all the iron that's in a sediment, if there's high amounts of these species called highly reactive iron species, then that sediment, whether it was yesterday or a billion years ago, probably accumulated beneath a water column that had oxygen in it. If there, if it's low in those things, then it's an oxygenated environment. If it's high, then there was probably no oxygen in the water column above the sediments that we're looking at. And so if you look at that diagram there, you can see that a bunch of the analyses which show on the y-axis how much of this highly reactive iron is there as a percentage of total iron. And then the x-axis is something called degree of pyritization, and that just says how much of this stuff that's highly reactive is actually fool's gold or iron pyrite. And if you look at the lower left-hand quadrant, that's where shallow waters from the Black Sea plot. If you look at the upper right-hand column, that's where the anoxic bottom waters of the Black Sea plot. And the interesting thing about this graph is it's not showing the Black Sea. It's showing samples that we took from a basin that was about 1.5 billion years old. And it very clearly tells us that this basin, 40% of the way back through Earth history, had a little bit of oxygen at the surface, but none at depth. And by now, people have done many thousands of these kind of analyses, and there's this really consistent pattern that helps us to plot the history of oxygen. Okay, so the first important marker spot is about 2.2 to 2.4 billion years ago, about halfway through our planet's history. Before that, there is very little, if any, evidence that there was a persistent or quantitatively important accumulation of oxygen gas. After that, the planet was starting on its road to modernity. And how do we know that? Well, if you look at that larger picture in the upper right, those beautiful red rocks that you see in outcrop are what are called banded iron formation. It's a rock that's made up of silica or quartz and iron minerals. Banded iron formation is almost ubiquitous in sedimentary accumulations before 2.4 billion years ago, and then it largely disappears. And it's pretty clear that banded iron formations could not form in today's oceans. And the reason for that is the oceans are fully oxygenated, and when iron in solution comes in contact with oxygen, it pretty much immediately forms iron oxides, rust, if you will. So iron formations are telling us that the early Earth was quite different and there wasn't much oxygen around. Now, if you look at the lower right, that's a thin cut through a sandstone that was deposited about 2.7 billion years ago. And the large grain that's in the center there that has that yellow color to it, that is a grain that consists mostly of iron pyrite or fool's gold, iron sulfide. Turns out that even on the time scale of our lifetimes, if you expose pyrite to oxygen, it will actually oxidize to basically form gypsum. The fact that that grain was exposed on a mountainside, was eroded away, traveled down through a river, and ended up being deposited in a shallow marine environment without ever coming into contact with oxygen, again, tells you that the early Earth was oxygen poor. And there are half a dozen different minerals that have this property. They all give the same pattern, and it's a pattern that coincides pretty much exactly to the presence and absence of iron formation. So something interesting is happening at halfway through our planet's history. The one thing we can do to actually get some quantitative constraints on this has to do with sulfur, and in particular the isotopes of sulfur. Now, just to have a very brief, and I hope not too chemistry lesson, the the types of chemical reactions that an element can undergo are a function of the number of protons and electrons that it has. All sulfur atoms have 16 protons, and that determines what kinds of chemistry it can do. But it turns out not all sulfur atoms are the same because they differ in the number of neutrons that they have. There's sulfur 32, which has 16 protons and 16 neutrons, but then there are three other sulfur isotopes, so-called, which have more neutrons. And while that doesn't change the kinds of chemistry that sulfur can undergo, it changes the rate at which different sulfur atoms get involved in these chemical reactions. So, for example, there are bacteria that use sulfate to respire, just the way you and I use oxygen. And they preferentially take up sulfur from sulfur 32 relative to sulfur 34 and do it by an amount that we can quantify and see again back through most of Earth history. Now, okay, so that's the background. Now, this became more interesting some years ago when a graduate student named Jane Farquhar, working in Mark Tiemann's geochemical lab at the University of California, San Diego, was given a piece of a Martian meteorite, a meteorite that unambiguously was broken off from the Martian surface and ended up on Earth. And there were sulfur-bearing minerals. So he did something that was actually pretty tricky to do at the time. He measured the amount of sulfur 32, 33, 34, and 36. Now, people had not done that to most samples on Earth because it was pretty clear that the amount of sulfur, if you measured the abundant isotopes, 34 and 32, you could actually calculate how much 33 and 35 were there because the differences between them varied as a function of their weight. That was simple. The problem was that when James measured these isotopes on Mars, they just blew that observation to smithereens. There was not a mass-dependent relationship between these things. And then James did something, what for many of us was even more interesting. He started looking at sulfur minerals like pyrite that were deposited from the early Earth. And again, it found that they did not adhere to this mass dependence. And what you see on that lower left, and I won't go into it in detail, but basically everything that departs from that x-axis that you see is a signature of sulfur minerals that depart from mass dependence. And you can see that pretty much everything you measure before 2.4 billion years ago shows this signature, and nothing that you measure afterward does. So something changed, and what James and his mentor, Mark Tiemann's, proposed, and I think they were right, is that the kind of chemistry they were seeing represented from the early Earth and early Mars was really a chemistry that went on in the upper atmosphere in an atmosphere that had no oxygen. So what causes that signature to end is the first time we see an atmosphere with oxygen. And then the final rung here is that people have modeled this, and it's pretty clear that the maximum amount of oxygen that could have been in the atmosphere before 2.4 billion years ago was about a millionth of the oxygen today. So basically, all the ways we look at this early history say the same thing. No oxygen, and then the world starts on the road to modernity about 2.4 to 2.2 billion years ago. Now, why would that be? What would be the sources of oxygen that might be large enough to account for this transformation of a planet? And the answer is photosynthesis. In photosynthesis by plants, ones in your own garden, they take CO2 and they need to combine that with electrons to make sugars. And they get those electrons from water by breaking it down and giving off oxygen gas in the process. That chemistry only ever evolved once in Earth history. And you're looking at a slide of the organisms that evolved it. They're called cyanobacteria, and they are bacteria that actually do and actually invented what we insist on calling green plant photosynthesis, but it's really that green plants do cyanobacterial photosynthesis. In fact, if you many of you will know that the site of photosynthesis in a maple tree in your garden is a little organelle in the leaf cells called a chloroplast. What you may not know is historically, chloroplasts originated as once free-living cyanobacteria that were captured by another cell and eventually reduced to metabolic slavery. So oxygen by cyanobacteria is part of the answer. And people propose maybe that's the whole answer. Maybe it's just that cyanobacteria evolved 2.4 billion years ago, and that's all you need to know to explain this pattern in history. There are two kinds of problems. One's biological, one's physical. One of the things that you can do now that we live in an age where we have genetic and genomic material for many different species is you can actually quantify the differences between the genes of different species. And if we use those to make what's called a phylogeny, which is just an evolutionary tree, but by quantifying those differences, if we have some places where fossils help us to calibrate the tree, we can actually make estimates for things that happened in the past. Here's one of the early ones by Schirmeister et al. And what they concluded was that, in fact, the first oxygen-producing cyanobacteria didn't evolve 2.4 billion years ago. They evolved more like 2.7 or 2.8 billion years ago, which suggests that cyanobacteria were around for hundreds of millions of years before the world changed. And a lot of people have done this. This is a recent one by a colleague at MIT called Greg Fournier. Very similar thing. Somewhere between 3 and 2.7 billion years ago, the ability to photosynthesize using water and giving off oxygen originated, and that was well before the world changed. And then there's some geological data that back this up. As we were talking about a little bit earlier, there are in ancient sedimentary rocks some proxies that tell us when the sediments that we're looking at were near to or in contact with oxygen. And it turns out that while the world changed and changed permanently 2.4 billion years ago, there are, at this point, 24 instances of what have been called whiffs of oxygen in older rocks. That is local, transient places where oxygen did begin to accumulate, but it never, blossomed up to a global phenomenon. So both biology and geology are suggesting to us that it can't be the origin of photosynthesis that is responsible here. Something else must be going. There must be something that is keeping the amount of oxygen production by cyanobacteria below the amount needed to oxygenate the planet for hundreds of millions of years. Well, we can get some insights as to what that might be by putting on our hats as ecologists for a moment. This is a wonderful place I've had a chance to work. It's in an uninhabited island in the Turks and Caicos group. And what you're looking at is the interior of this island is almost completely covered by microbial mat communities. Same kind of thing that has been forming in different Earth environments for most of its history. Now, if you take just a shovel and pull out a cross section of these mats, you'll see there in the lower right that the top is green or blue-green, and that is these cyanobacteria that are building the mat, producing oxygen. As you go down into the mat, you run out of oxygen as you go down, and you run out of light. But in this particular mat, you run out of oxygen before you run out of light, and that's where you see that pink layer. The pink layer is photosynthetic bacteria that don't use water. Rather, they use things like hydrogen sulfide or hydrogen gas or actually dissolved iron, and they don't produce oxygen. And so even today, where there are things other than water from which you can derive electrons for photosynthesis, cyanobacteria don't do very well. It's expensive to get your electrons from water, and these other photosynthetic bacteria rule the day. So maybe it is that while cyanobacteria existed, there weren't that many times and places where the environment actually favored them over these other kinds of bacteria. Now, it turns out, now we go back to geology again. It turns out that if you had actually been in a space capsule and flew around the Earth 3 billion years ago, it would basically have looked like a water world. Yes, there were volcanoes that stood out above the water, and there was a little bit of crust, but largely this was a water world. And there are two reasons for that. One is, and they both have to do with the fact that Earth's mantle was probably a good deal hotter than it is today. When the mantle is hot, it can't support high continents of the type we see today. So you just don't have high mountains the way we're used to. But also, it turns out that if the mantle was as hot as most people think it was, it couldn't have carried much water in it. Today, there's at least an ocean's worth of water in Earth's mantle, but that would have been degassed and gone up to the surface. So if you add another ocean's worth of water, even today, to the oceans, there wouldn't be much land. So anyway, because of those two reasons, there wasn't much land, there wasn't much weathering and erosion, so there wasn't much in the way of nutrients coming in to the basins. And in fact, there wasn't much in the way of things that could bring those nutrients back from organic matter and sort of remineralize them so they could be used again. And so while everyone agrees that the amount of photosynthesis on the early Earth was low, through work, this Howe et al. Paper, and I'm just an et al., but a really bright young man named Jihua Howe did the work, that as the continents become larger and more exposed, you get more nutrients coming in, and that can actually tip the scales in favor of cyanobacteria. So what we think is happening is that while oxygen, there were microorganisms that could produce oxygen well before this oxygenation event at 2.4 billion years ago, it probably was only the rise of large stable continents and the exposure of large stable continents that put a lot of phosphorus into the environment. That way you would still have nutrients when you ran out of things like iron or sulfur for photosynthesis. And at that point, cyanobacteria become what are sometimes called ecosystem engineers. They produce enough oxygen that the sunlit zone of the oceans is basically scrubbed of all these other kinds of electron sources. And so the world changes, and it changes permanently. So if you think about it then, There's a biological part of this story. There's a geological part of this story. Now, you might ask yourself, what did the Earth look like when this event was over? Was it like today's? And the answer is no. We were going to have another 2 billion years where there was probably 1 or maybe a few percent of today's oxygen levels, but the world still has oxygenated waters in the upper part, but most of the oceans were still oxygen free. And again, there's a dozen different geochemical proxies for this. Again, they all give the same answer, that as we go into Earth's middle age, we have an environmentally distinctive interval of Earth history that again lasts almost 2 billion years. So we can ask ourselves, what's going on there? And again, it seems to have a lot to do with Earth's tectonics, the physical structure of the Earth. That while, yes, there are some mountains forming that, there were no high mountains. And we have that, again, there's pretty good chemical proxies for that. It was a world in which you just had low rising continents. You would have limited amounts of phosphorus coming into the oceans. A lot of that phosphorus would get pulled out by reaction with iron in the deep waters, and it was a low productivity world. There was, however, enough oxygen to support a totally new type of cell, and that is a nucleated cell or a eukaryotic organism. Interestingly, we first start seeing fossils of eukaryotes about 17 or 1800 million years ago, not long after the atmosphere became oxic. And basically, while there are a few secondary exceptions, all eukaryotes use oxygen for respiration. And so eukaryotes become possible when we start to have an oxygenated world. Again, not only are there fossils that suggest when eukaryotes were starting to take off, there are a variety of molecular clocks. They're pretty compatible with the fossil record that no later than 1700 million years ago, bacteria and their cousins, the archaea, had been on Earth since probably 4 billion years ago, but now, more than halfway through Earth history, we have these new types of cells. And there's actually, I put this in just because this paper just came out 2 weeks ago by a person named Philip Donahue and his colleagues at the University of Bristol in England. And if you look at that bottom part, they did a clever thing. They did molecular clocks not for species and for types of organisms, but for types of genetic structures, types of physiological structures. And what they found is that many of the things that we associate with eukaryotic cells today actually evolved very early, before the great oxygenation event. But the two things that really are the sine qua non of eukaryotes, mitochondria, which is where respiration takes place, and once again, your mitochondria began life as free-living bacteria that were captured and reduced to metabolic slavery. Those only come in around 17 or 1800 million years ago. And the genetic structures that are used in something like meiosis, which is a cell division pattern that's unique to eukaryotes, they only come in there as well. So the more we're learning about the comparative biology and its estimates for the antiquity of eukaryotes, they all say something of the same thing, that eukaryotes become possible only after the Earth starts to become oxygenated. Now, again, this is a slightly different version of what I showed you just a minute ago, but what it's, again, telling us is that essentially the story of O has 3 big chapters. The first is when there's none. The second, this interval from 2.4 to, say, 600 million years ago, where there's some oxygen, but not much. And then only as we start to approach the last 600 million years or so, do we start to see higher oxygen levels. And there's another thing that's kind of interesting. Despite the fact that eukaryotes, including photosynthetic eukaryotes, exist for much of this middle age of Earth, cyanobacteria continued to be the major primary producers. And if we can understand why that might be true, it might give us some insights as to this second jump in oxygen that's going to make the world much more modern. So here's some interesting work that was done in Australia in the lab, I'm very happy to say, of my former postdoc, Jochen Brox. And what Jochen and his colleagues did was not look for fossils, but look for molecular evidence of life. And they found that when you looked in rocks that were older than about 650 million years old, you never saw any of the so-called biomarker molecules that tell us about green algae. They're just not there. You first start seeing them only about a little over 600 million years ago, but by 550 million years ago, there are green algae in the plankton everywhere. So that's interesting. Green algae existed a billion years ago, but they really flower around 600 million years ago. Now, why would that be interesting? And to that, again, we look at ecology, and if you look at today's ocean, still a quarter of all the photosynthesis in the oceans is done by cyanobacteria. And the cyanobacteria tend to be in those dark blue and sort of purple areas of the ocean, so-called central gyres, where nutrient levels are very low. And when nutrient levels are low, cyanobacteria compete very well against things like green algae. It's only in parts of the ocean where there are more nutrients available that you start to seeing things like green algae become important. So maybe what happened 600 million years ago is that once again we have a change from the physical world that is pushing more nutrients into the ocean. And once again, we're going to look at phosphorus. And what you're looking at in that outcrop picture on the upper left is a mine in China where basically this is all ore grade phosphorus minerals, the kind of stuff that gets made into fertilizer. It's a remarkable deposit. We've been interested in it for years because there is just beautiful preservation of all sorts of organisms from this phosphorus as it's being precipitated. Some of the best preservation in the first 4 billion years of Earth history. And what's interesting is there's more phosphorus ore in this one formation than there is in the entire geologic record up to that time. And after this, we have again and again and again phosphorus ore formation happening around the world. So something really changes. It changes nutrient availability. That changes both who's doing the photosynthesis and how much photosynthesis can be done. Why might that happen? Well, we're going to go back to geology again. Turns out that about this time, there's a major mountain building event called the Trans-African Orogeny. And you can see a map of what the continents looked like at this time. And this produced the first Himalaya-scale mountains that the planet had seen in more than 1 billion years. So we now have these high, rapidly eroding mountains. They're feeding a lot more phosphorus into the oceans, and that will feed a lot more photosynthesis. Now, there's one more wrinkle to it, which is I think, kind of fun. If you look at where the phosphorus comes from that's taken up by photosynthetic organisms in today's oceans, only about 3% of it comes directly from the weathering and erosion of continents. Most of it comes from organic matter that cells die, they get transported to the deep ocean and the seafloor, and then they're chomped up by mostly other bacteria, and phosphorus is released and it comes back to the surface. That's 97% of the phosphorus that's being used. We don't think that part of the phosphorus cycle was working very well before 600 million years ago, but with this big influx of phosphorus, you produce not only more photosynthesis, but more oxygen. Oxygen starts to spread more widely through the planet. And again, we can have a permanent state change. And once again, there is an evolutionary correlate to this. This is the time when we think that there's more photosynthesis, more oxygen. It's when we first start seeing large animals. At first, these kind of things, which are about the oldest things we can look at and at least have some confidence they were made by simple animals, they had fairly low oxygen demands. I'm going to skip that. But then very soon thereafter, we start to see things that are more closely related to things that are in the ocean today, such as these organisms, which have many of the features that we find in a group called mollusca today that contains snails and clams and things like that. These moved around. Some of them were predatory. They had higher oxygen demands. And then soon after that, we see this flowering of a fairly familiar animal world in the oceans at the beginning of the so-called Cambrian period. We see things that we know look like worms, we know look like mollusks, that we know look like arthropods, the group that has insects and lobsters and things like that today. And even there are vertebrates, there are early fish in the Cambrian period. And again, many of those need more oxygen. So getting close to the end now, but we can ask, how much oxygen do you actually need to make an animal? And there was a well-known experiment done by a graduate student named Dan Mills in the lab of Don Canfield in Denmark, and he grew sponges at very low oxygen tensions, just a couple percent of the oxygen levels in the ocean today, and he was able to keep the sponges alive. Now, he didn't grow them through an entire life cycle, so maybe you could be a little worried there. But we know from ecological surveys that animals do exist down to very low oxygen levels. Some of these animals are 200 microns long and 20 microns wide, but nonetheless, where there's at least some oxygen, you can get more animals. But some animals need a lot more oxygen, and the animals that need a lot more oxygen are carnivores. If you have to hunt prey, and for many carnivores in the oceans, they stuff their prey down in their gullet, and the sort of respiratory demand of dealing with that food is very high. So you need at least 8 to 10% of today's oxygen levels to make the kinds of animal biology we see by the beginning of the Cambrian period. I won't worry about this now, but it tells us that there's this sort of interesting spot at around 8 to 10% of current levels of oxygen. Above that, we expect to see a fair amount of animal diversity of the kinds of things we know and understand. Before that, not so much. Okay, penultimate slide. There's now a lot of information that has accumulated, which is, again, telling us a consistent story. If you look at the upper right-hand picture from Stocky et al., what was done there is that basically all of the chemical information relevant to oxygen accumulation was put together, and what it tells us is, again, until about 600, a little less 600 million years ago, there's very little oxygen. It goes up to maybe 10 or 20% of current levels. And only around 400 million years ago do we start seeing evidence of an oxygen-rich planet that has enough oxygen so that there's oxygen all the way down through the oceans. And that there's a number of different lines of evidence. I won't go into the things that you see in the bottom, but those are two different chemical signatures. They tell a consistent story, and that's pretty much the case. So we want to ask one final question then. What might have happened 400 million years ago to bring Earth's oxygen levels close to what we have today? And to a first approximation, I think the answer is trees. So we get, beginning around 450 million years ago, we start having photosynthetic organisms living on land plants. And by 400, a little bit less million years ago, we actually have trees. That tree, which I think is on the campus of Oklahoma State University, that is a tree that lived about 370 million years ago. And it's the size of a big pine tree today. Why is that important? Because plants make a lot of organic compounds that are not easily broken down by bacteria or fungi. So you're going to have more material being produced that, rather than getting respired again, it'll get buried in sediments. And that has two consequences. One, this event, biological event, gave rise in fairly short order to what's called the Carboniferous period. And that has a pretty good reason for its name, because much of the coal that has been mined for the last several hundred years formed in swamps during the Carboniferous period. Certainly, most of the coal in the eastern and midwestern United States and elsewhere. Now, that has another consequence, because if you're burying that organic matter, you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, putting it into plant material, and burying the plant material. So CO2 should come down. And not surprisingly, if you follow that line of logic, this was a time of widespread continental glaciation on the planet. And I just wanted to call attention to this diagram on the left, because I really like it. I have a friend in Tel Aviv named Ron Milo who lives to quantify everything in biology. And a few years ago, he and some colleagues tried to quantify how much different groups of organisms contributed to the total biomass of the planet. And what you can see there on the left is most of the biomass is plants. Now, plants cheat because in many plants, much of their cells are non-living. So wood is largely non-living cells, but that's like 70%, 80% of the biomass. And bacteria are second. And, since we're all animals in here and probably have egos, much less than 1% of Earth's biomass is animals. And again, the evolution of trees with their wood and that has left its imprint both on the atmospheric composition and on the climate. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and can try to address any questions you might have. Again, the details, in a sense, it's not that they don't matter, but they're not the main point. The main point is that what we see around us, in both the case of oxygen and in many other parts of their system, reflects both biological and geological influences. You will never be able to know the history of oxygen only by looking at geology. You will never be able to understand it only by looking at biology. And so with that, I would just point out that much of my work in this area was done with students and colleagues, and I am thankful to them all and thankful for the people who have seen fit to fund our work over the years. So thanks, and we can take questions.
Uh, Thank you, Andy. That was a great talk. Really interesting. We've
Okay.
got a few questions coming in, but let me just ask you a couple from very, very early Earth. Uh, you pointed out that we were a water world for a billion or so years. That the whole planet was covered by water. Where did the water come from?
Well, the water comes to the earth as part of the accretion of the earth. Uh, for a long time, people thought it might be coming from comets, but it turns out you can actually look at the hydrogen isotope composition of at least a couple of comets, and it doesn't match what water on Earth looks like. So it looks like maybe 10% of the water on Earth comes from comets. The rest comes from meteorites that are rich in water and other volatiles. And there's an increasing view that some of that is sort of late stage accretion, that you accrete all this stuff that's rich in iron and silica and things like this. And then late in the process, which is still 4.5 billion years ago, you have more and more input from types of meteorites, which we still see today, which, can sometimes have 20% water in them. So the water is here to begin with. Much of it will be in the materials that goes to form the mantle. And then, as I said, through time, the hot mantle will just release that water and it'll come up to the surface.
And when the Earth was first formed, the sun was at about 70% of its current, 75% of its current luminosity. So why wasn't that water ice at the time?
Well, this is one of the other magic tricks that carbon dioxide plays for us. There is something called this faint young sun paradox, which is one of these things that has a life of its own just because it's kind of interesting to think about. And it asks exactly that question. If the sun was only 70% as luminous as it is now, and I should say that that's pretty much accepted by astrophysicists, that would be an expected part of the sun's history, that how does the Earth keep from just being an ice ball? And the answer, one way or another, has to be greenhouse gases. So if you accumulate a lot of CO2 and some methane and things like this, you can actually keep the Earth from freezing over. And then the really neat part of it, at least I think it's really neat, is it's become pretty clear that one of the things that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, which I mentioned early on, is just weathering of rock surfaces. And that turns out to be a temperature dependent process. So if it's hotter, then it goes faster and you pull more CO2 out. Then the Earth starts to cool, and then it doesn't go as fast, and the CO2 comes back. So again, it's this intricate set of processes that would have, what it appears just empirically, kept the Earth over the last 4 billion years in a state where there were always liquid oceans, and therefore there was always environments for life.
Yeah, just following on from that, you say on your book in several places that it may not be surprising that life could form on other planets. There are billions and billions of them, so there are plenty of planets to choose from. But the real surprise is just what you said, that our planet has been habitable for 4 billion years, and that it's likely to be rare because of all of the things that can upset that. Um, so, what I'd like you to just talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I tend to feel strongly about this in the same way that many scientists do about things where we have no data. And, the reality is we know about life at exactly one place in the universe, and that's us. Now, okay. Now, we're starting to learn more about other planets and moons in our own solar system. And I actually wrote a paper with my colleague, Robin Wordsworth, a few years ago where we looked at Mars, and the old idea was that Mars was warm and wet for the first 600 million years, and then it gradually dried out to be this not very biofriendly planet that it is now. But more and more, from my perspective, the sedimentary geology makes it look like Mars during the period when it was, quote, warm and wet. It was probably warm and wet for 100,000 years and then dry for 20 million. And then Robin's modeling suggests that with major volcanism or big impacts, you can regenerate a warm and wet environment, which then over a period of 100,000 years will dissipate. And that. So Mars, if it ever had life, there was no chance for it to proliferate and persevere. The same thing is true with Venus. There are certainly people who think early on Venus might have been able to support life. There's some controversy there, but it's possible. But again, for a long time now, Venus has had this so-called runaway greenhouse effect. So the surface temperature is something like 625 degrees Celsius, something like this, and obviously no life there. And that then gets back to a very famous offhanded statement by a famous physicist, Enrico Fermi, who was once, I think, coming out of lunch or something like this, and he just kind of looked at his colleagues who were interested in life in the universe, and he says, "Where is everybody?" Because it's not only that we don't have life in our solar system, but we have so far no very strong evidence either from the physical makeup of a planetary atmosphere or somebody telling us where they are that there is life somewhere else. Now, it may be that there is intelligent life on other places. There are all sorts of reasons why we might not know about it. But I think there is something to this idea that although, as you said, there are now thought to be trillions of galaxies, each one's with something like a billion or more stars, that even if only one planet in a million or one planet and moon in a million gives rise to life, that's a lot of life. But, much of those might just be around for millions, tens of millions of years. And if you think about it, we are now characterizing intelligent life in terms of technological intelligence and that. But the kind of technologies that could, even in principle, allow you to communicate with life in another solar system have only been around for the last 100 years or less. And so there's 4 billion years there where life could have been going merrily along on Earth. And it's not entirely clear that could be recognized, Earth would be recognized as a biological planet by somebody out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I see we're past the witching hour. Thank you very much. That was a great talk.
Thank you all for listening.
And we have a tradition that people will take off their mute and thank you for the talk. Yeah. So please do that.
That was great. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All the way from Wales.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wales. It's from Wales.
I should have worn my Frank Assista male voice choir pin.
Most definitely, yes.
I have one, by the way.
I believe you.
Welsh.
Doing
All
fairly
right.
dirty.
Well, thank you, Andy, and I hope the book does really well. It deserves to.
Again, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be with you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good night. Thanks.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.